2 years after Savili Feinberg's death, and into the operation of the very first RBMK 1000 reactor, a major incident occurred. The year was 1975, and the reactor was Unit 1 of the Leningrad Nuclear Power Plant. The core was damaged, and radiation was released. While not a catastrophe like Chernobyl, this was an extraordinary incident. What is striking about it is that its circumstances bear a remarkable resemblance to Chernobyl. The reactor had operated for about 2 years, approaching the steady-state long-term refueling mode. At this point, its fuel was burnt deeply. Additional absorbers were extracted according to plan, and its void and power coefficients of reactivity were at their highest. Leningrad Unit 1, like Chernobyl Unit 4, was reduced to 50% of its power as one of its 2 turbines was taken offline. An operator mistakenly shut down the remaining turbine, causing an automatic shutdown of the reactor. Apparently, unlike at Chernobyl, there was no key of delay to cause a xenon depoisoning of the core at 50% power, and furthermore, the reactor was actually briefly shut down, rather than just being dropped in power. Its operating reactivity margin, or number of effective control rods in the core, was consequently under serious downward pressure as the core was being poisoned with xenon. The ORM at Leningrad in 1975 fell to a lower level than the lowest level at Chernobyl in 1986. Yet the reactor was successfully shut down by the emergency protection system after the initial drop in power not once but twice more. Furthermore, at least one of the shutdowns that followed was prompted by accelerating power, or the reactor running away. Did you see something here you were expecting to see? Where is the positive scram effect? Under a very brief subsection of INSAG 7 titled Implications of Ignoring Deficiencies, we see the following. Annexes 1 and 2 indicate that important problems now recognised in the Chernobyl plant design had in fact been recognised before the accident. INSAG notes the observations made at the Ignalina plant in 1983, when the possibility of positive reactivity insertion on shutdown became evident, and the event at the Leningrad nuclear power plant in 1975, which, in retrospect, indicated that events excited by local reactivity feedback could cause damage to the reactor. According to INSAG 7, it wasn't until 1983 that the positive scram effect became evident. The 1975 incident, despite occurring in very similar circumstances to the 1986 Chernobyl incident, was only notable for local reactivity feedback could cause damage to the reactor. In 1975, the emergency protection system worked, rather than causing the accident. When INSAG 7 comments on the aftermath of the Leningrad incident on pages 47 and 48, the focus is on the speed of the emergency protection system, not on it being an emergency prompting system and inserting reactivity rather than reducing it. Alexander Rumyantsev points us in a generally unknown direction of a modification in control rod design, not before but after RBMK reactors had begun operation. First, let's make a quick stop at INSAG 7 to point out the document contradicts itself. On page 43, in Annex 1, there is a paragraph describing multiple different control rod designs prior to the RBMK reactors entering operation. A draft design is mentioned, then a technical design, and then a final working design. Notice that in the final working design, the absorber length of the reactor control and protection system rods was supposed to be 5 meters. For the second stage reactors, the later units at RBMK nuclear power plants, the number of rods was increased, but the design is supposed to have been unchanged. Except if we're to refer to page 128 in Annex 2 of INSAG 7, we see an image clearly showing us the absorbed length of control rods at the time of the Chernobyl disaster having been a little over 6 meters. So not even INSAG 7 manages to be consistent on RBMK control rod design. Rumyantsev, along with a co-author, titles a 2016 Proatom article, Chernobyl, Tragedy, Farce and Lessons. As this is a Bobby video script, the word that attracts us the most is farce. What is the farce of Chernobyl, according to Rumyantsev? Let's read it. During the period 1976 to 1978, in order to save concrete by reducing the height of the sub-reactor space, both the chief designer, Nikiet, and the scientific director, I.V. Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, made a joint decision to shorten the graphite displacers on the control rods with the formation of columns of water 1.2 meters high under them. Despite significant differences in the physics and thermal hydraulics of the proposed RBMK-type reactors from the developed industrial reactors, in order to save resources and time, it was decided to abandon the creation of a prototype reactor and immediately begin mass production of these not yet brought to fruition reactors. At the design stage, the features of the physics and thermal hydraulics of RBMK-type reactors were not thoroughly analysed. The discovery of a positive density effect of reactivity in RBMK-type reactors was also not considered a big problem, because a similar effect was recorded in industrial reactors that were successfully operated. The combination in time of the stages of design and operation of RBMK-type reactors led to multiple design errors, which were identified only during operation and were eliminated through multiple upgrades at nuclear power plants already operating and under construction. The design decision to save concrete by reducing the height of the sub-reactor space by 2 meters, followed by shortening the displacers of the control rods, under which columns of water 1.2 meters high were formed, turned out to be fateful for the RBMK reactors. 3 years before the Chernobyl accident, direct experiments showed the danger of such a solution. However, timely actions, which required costs and suspension of operation of RBMK nuclear power plants, were not taken by the designers and operators. The main conclusion was, and remains, that it was the shortening of the graphite displacers on the control rods that predetermined the unprecedented scale of the Chernobyl accident. Without shortening the displacers on the control rods, the scale of the accident would have been comparable to the accident at the first unit of the Leningrad nuclear power plant in December 1975, which is no longer remembered today. In looking to verify Rumyantsev's claim, we have come across another, more subtle version of a control rod design modification in proximity to the Chernobyl disaster, thanks to a person known as Papitum on Reddit, Min Threadmash on YouTube, and various Threadmash variations on Discord. For evidence on this version, we first note a 1980 book written by the director of Nikiet, Nikolai Dolezhal, and another senior figure. On page 38 we find the following. To reduce the harmful absorption of neutrons in cooling water, PP, AZ, and USP rods have displacers with an outer diameter of 74 and length of 4,960 mm. Thus, when these rods are completely removed from the core, a displacer is located in the channel symmetrically relative to the centre of the core, and the sections of the channel with a length of approximately 1 meter are filled with water from above and below the displacer. RBMK reactor cores were 7 meters in height. A displacer length of around 5 meters means that the water columns at the top and bottom of the reactor core were around 1 meter when control rods were fully extracted. This is different from displacers being 4.5 meters long and leaving water columns of around 1.25 meters, as are the known dimensions at the time of the Chernobyl disaster. In a Kurchatov Institute book from 2003 on the history of atomic energy in the USSR and Russia, we encounter the following on page 165. The introduction of fuel with 2% enrichment at RBMK power plants gathered pace. After loading reactors 1 and 2 at Leningrad Nuclear Power Plant with 2% enriched fuel assemblies, over 600 fuel assemblies per reactor, another physical problem emerged: insufficient compensating capabilities, effectiveness, of the control and protection system rods. During the startup of Leningrad Nuclear Power Plant Unit 3, which was loaded entirely with 2% enriched fuel assemblies, the problem became decisive. The issue was that the SUZ rods consisted of 5 absorbing sections, overall length roughly 5 meters, and 5 sections of displacer, joined together with a telescoping rod. To increase the effectiveness of the control rods, their design was altered. The new rods had 6 absorbing sections and 4 displacer sections, joined by the telescoping rod. Because the overall length of the SUZ rods, absorber plus telescoping rod plus displacer, could not be increased, in its raised position, the displacer left behind a roughly 1.3 meter column of water. This book is in agreement with the 1980 Nikiet book on the graphite displacers having been longer than commonly known at 5 meters, the same length as the absorbing boron part of the control rods. Each part was comprised of 5 sections of about 1 meter. As the nuclear fuel was being upgraded after the 1975 Leningrad incident, somewhat marginally from 1.8 to 2% enrichment, it turned out that the control rod and protection system rods were insufficiently effective. This problem became decisive during the startup of Leningrad Unit 3 at the end of 1979, which means that the implementation of a control rod modification would have occurred in the 1980s. There is another wrinkle. If the previous control and protection system rods had 5 sections totaling 5 meters of boron and graphite each, how did the modified control and protection system rods end up with 6 sections of boron totaling around 6 meters and 4 sections of graphite totaling around 4.5 meters? According to the Kurchatov Institute history book, the overall length of the SUZ rod, absorber plus telescoping rod plus displacer, could not be increased. How do you lose 1 section of graphite seemingly redistributed to boron, yet lose only half its length? There is a possible indirect suggestion of the graphite displacers being shorter than 4.5 meters, and consequently the water columns being longer than 1.25 meters in a 1984 letter from the Ignalina nuclear power plant. A positive reactivity run-up has been observed within 1.5 meters of movement for manual control rods, and 2.5 meters for automatic regulator rods. Do you notice a discrepancy when reading this from further down the letter? During this, above and below remain columns of water 1.2 meters each. Due to the special design of the connection for the joints of the automatic regulator rods, the displacer is positioned asymmetrically, therefore has a column of water only under. As the displacer is the same, the height of the column of water is 2.5 meters. The distance of the positive reactivity run-up effect matches the size of the water columns for the automatic regulator rods, roughly 2.5 meters. However, the distance of the positive reactivity run-up effect for the rest of the control rods is greater, at 1.5 meters, than the size of the water columns at 1.25 meters. Let's get really weird. A few people belong to a small Telegram group where documents are posted. This is supposed to be from a 1985 study guide for senior reactor control engineers. What catches our attention is this part. Structurally, the rods are made of separate absorbing links of 907.5 mm each, with a gap between the links of 65 mm. To reduce the harmful absorption of neutrons in the cooling water, all control and protection system rods, except automatic regulators, have displacers with a length of 4 meters, USP 5 meter displacer. Thus, when the control rods are completely removed from the core in the channel, a displacer is located symmetrically relative to the centre of the core, and sections of the channel with a length of approximately 1 metre above and below the displacer are filled with water. Obviously, with displacers of 4 metres in length, the water columns would be more specifically around 1.5 metres in length. If you look at the 4 metre part, you can see a distinctive blot. Furthermore, the number 4 has a different appearance than the 4 at the bottom of the excerpt, and the hyphen is shorter and higher up than other hyphens in the excerpt. Also, no distinction seems to be made between first stage and second stage reactors. We do not know what to make of this. We find further evidence of this more subtle version of a partial control rod design modification in international documents after the Chernobyl disaster. On the control rod specifications page of this 1987 United States report on the Chernobyl disaster, we find what we now recognise as old specifications. The individual sections are each about 1 metre long, and the graphite displacers leave 1 metre long columns at the top and the bottom of the 7 metre reactor, meaning the graphite displacers are comprised of 5 sections amounting to about 5 metres in length. A couple of pages earlier, this is stated explicitly. Interestingly, the paragraph above this statement claims that the absorbers were comprised of 6 sections, which is clearly contradicted by the schematic we just saw. Clearly there is some sloppiness in this report, but what it shows us is that the Americans were getting these specifications from somewhere. They didn't make them up, although they overlooked their significance. Here is another document, this time Canadian, dating to 1988. Page 35 shows the control rod design for RBMK 1000s. The boron and the graphite components of the control rods are incorrectly shown as having been 5 sections each. This is nearly 2 years after the disaster. Scrolling to the next page again shows the graphite portion being 5 metres long and leaving 1 metre long water columns. Incidentally, the American report contains a very similar depiction of the control rods to what we see in the Canadian document, but the numbers are obscure due to the poor quality of the document. Why do we care so much about whether the water columns were 1 metre long, 1.25 metres long, or 1.5 metres long, you ask? Look at the distribution of the neutron flux on the night of the Chernobyl disaster, in particularly the pre-emergency distribution. Also, notice where the peak is on the emergency distributions. As you can see, at right around 1 metre from the bottom of the reactor core, you're starting to hit the bottom hump of the neutron distribution. This means that any distance from this point on that had water in it was of disproportionate significance in terms of neutron absorption. The more of this water there is to displace, the greater the positive reactivity introduced. According to Annex 1, what it terms the critical height varied from 0.7 metres to 2 metres. To underscore, we believe that a control rod design modification in proximity to the Chernobyl disaster was key. Even 25 centimetres could have had a significant impact on a positive scram effect. As we have mentioned before, a highly curious piece of circumstantial evidence is the discovery of the positive scram effect. Annex 1 of INSAG 7 specifies the Chief Design Engineer, aka Nikiet, and the Scientific Manager, aka Kachatov Institute of Atomic Energy, knew about this effect before the accident. It was discovered experimentally in November/December of 1983, during the physical startup of Ignalina Unit 1 and that of Chernobyl Unit 4, i.e. almost 2.5 years before the Chernobyl accident. Up to this point, 9 other RBMK reactors had undergone a startup without the apparent discovery of the positive scram effect. The 1984 letter from the Ignalina Nuclear Power Plant suggests it may have also been detected at Chernobyl Unit 3, timing not being very clear. What we also see is a response subsequent to this experimental discovery from the Chief Design Engineer and the Scientific Manager. Page 44 of INSAG 7 lists a number of proposals that followed, along with a quote from the Kurchatov Institute, that treats the possibility of a positive scram effect as novel and under-analysed. Notice something very important. In light of the emergence of the positive scram effect, the quote treats even something as ordinary as a power reduction to 50% as a potentially dangerous situation, with more dangerous situations to be revealed upon further analysis. Look at this quote on page 77 of INSAG 7. Note, the operating procedures permitted operating conditions similar to those prevailing at Chernobyl Unit 4 on the 26th of April 1986, and they might have occurred without any intervention on the part of the personnel. We only need to assume a perfectly possible situation in which triggering of EPS-3 occurs when the reactor is operating initially at rated power with an ORM of 26 manual control rods. Under these conditions, approximately 1 hour after triggering of EPS-3, the ORM could have fallen to less than 15 manual control rods at a reactor power of 200 to 300 megawatt thermal, and any further action, whether automatic or remote, to shut down the reactor could have led to a similar repetition of the events on the 26th of April 1986. Even in the comment section of videos on this channel, there is a prevailing belief that the rundown test created unique conditions, coupled with the violations by the operators that explain much of the disaster. This is what Soviet nuclear experts and authorities intended. We are inclined to believe the test, or experiment as it was referred to, is a red herring, conveniently used as a distraction to centre a false narrative on. Surely such an extraordinary outcome had everything to do with an exotic experiment. We offer the words of the Chernobyl Unit 4 morning shift supervisor on the 25th of April 1986, Igor Kazachkov, as food for thought. There have been no precedent. I have been working at nuclear power plants since 1974. I have seen much more cruel regimes here. I will say this. We have repeatedly had less than the permissible number of rods. And nothing exploded. Everything went fine. We also have this tidbit. According to Chernobyl past, present and future, for objectivity's sake, it should be noted that A. Kalugin, head of the Kurchatov Institute department, was the first who in a day after the accident stated its cause. A positive input of reactivity when inserting the control and protection rods into the reactor core. A. Kalugin from the Kurchatov Institute needed only a day to identify the positive scram effect as the cause of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. According to Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl, 2 experts on RBMK reactors were immediately dispatched from the Kurchatov Institute to the Chernobyl MPP to begin a forensic analysis of the data from the reactor. To one of the 2 specialists, Alexander Kalugin, who had dedicated his career to the RBMK project, it all seemed chillingly familiar. 2 years earlier, he had attended a meeting of the Reactor Design Bureau, NICIAT, at which someone had suggested that, under certain circumstances, the descending control rods might displace water from the bottom of the core, and cause a sudden spike in reactivity. At that time, the Institute scientists had dismissed this concern as too improbable to worry about. Now, as Kalugin gazed in dismay at the fearsome geometry of the computer printouts from reactor number 4, it seemed all too possible. According to this excerpt, despite having dedicated his career to the RBMK project and being one of 2 experts from the Kurchatov Institute going to the site to initiate a forensic analysis of the data from the reactor, Alexander Kalugin learned about the positive scram effect in 1984. If you're curious about the under certain too improbable circumstances bit, we might have you covered there too. The 1984 Ignalina letter features this sentence. We will underscore once more, a positive run-up of reactivity will be observed only during the movement of rods from the uppermost position, and only while having a neutron field distorted down. The while having a neutron field distorted down part is key. Deputy Chief Engineer of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant at the time of the disaster, and anointed villain, Anatoly Dyatlov, drops this stunner in his book, How It Was. Furthermore, in violation of regulations, personnel removed more than the allowable number of manual control absorbing rods from the core. The effectiveness of the emergency protection system was seriously reduced. There is not one paragraph in regulations indicating how many control rods can be removed from the core. There is only an indication in the RBMK operating instructions and in the RBMK RCPS operating instructions, where it is written that with a low reactivity margin, a neutron flux peaked in the bottom. The number of rods extracted completely from the core must be limited to 150, with the remaining rods inserted by no less than 0.5 meters. On April 26th, we had a neutron flux peaked in the top. Therefore, we violated no instructions. These addendums to the instructions, agreed upon by the scientific director and chief designer, then signed into effect by the deputy director of Nikyot, Y.M. Cherkashov, where in particular it says, we emphasize once again that the positive reactivity addition effect will be observed only with control rod motion from the extreme upper position, and only with the neutron flux skewed to the bottom. According to Dyatlov, one of the proposals made after the discovery of the positive scram effect was actually implemented, in contradiction of INSAG 7. However, this measure was conditional on the neutron flux peaking at the bottom, which was apparently a rare condition not present at Chernobyl. There was a lower hump, but the peak was towards the top of the reactor core. Well, as INSAG 7 clarifies, the neutron flux having to peak at the bottom of the core for the positive scram effect to manifest was an incorrect assumption. When control and safety rods were inserted from fully withdrawn positions under these circumstances, the positive scram effect discussed earlier could cause the lower part of the core to become supercritical, and the neutron distribution to shift quickly downwards, irrespective of the distribution just prior to rod insertion. Under the conditions of the accident, the shift in power distribution resulting from the positive scram could be substantial. The positive scram effect was one of two principal physical factors that accounted for the Chernobyl disaster. The other was a positive void coefficient of reactivity, high enough to flip the total power coefficient of reactivity positive 2, meaning that the reactor core would respond to an increase in power with a further increase in reactivity, forming a feedback loop. This reactor property had a colourful pre-Chernobyl history too. From Nikolai Karpan's table, who was the Deputy Chief Engineer of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant for Science and Nuclear Safety at the time of the disaster, along with INSAG 7 and some other sources, we know that the magic number for the positive void coefficient was plus 5 beta F. Every RBMK reactor existed with this coefficient after roughly 2 to 2.5 years into operation. Presently, it remains unclear whether the disastrous magnitudes of the coefficients or the void effect were transitory as the cores transitioned into a steady state refueling mode, or if they persisted indefinitely. There are some contradictory statements. Pages 36 and 37 of INSAG 7 are where we get the meat on this central topic. According to page 36, the disastrously high positive void coefficient existed from the first RBMK 1000 reactors about 2 years into their operation, as fuel burned up and additional absorbers were removed. Notice that in the first stage or generation RBMK 1000 reactors, this coefficient is reached with 30 to 40 additional absorbers remaining. The Scientific Research and Design Institute for Power Technology, or Nikyot for short, is supposed to have been aware of these coefficients from no later than 1977 for the Leningrad Nuclear Power Plant, and from no later than 1980 for the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. After the 1975 Leningrad incident, it was decided to upgrade the nuclear fuel from 1.8% enrichment to 2% enrichment. However, as additional absorbers continued to be removed, the same coefficient was approached. As shown in Karpan's table, where the magical coefficient value is hit with a single additional absorber remaining in the core of Chernobyl Unit 4. This caused the overall power coefficient of reactivity to flip from negative to positive, which spelled trouble big enough to have been warned against and eventually prohibited in regulations designers were supposed to comply with. As usual, we have another wrinkle. Nikolai Karpan, the Deputy Chief Engineer for Science and Nuclear Safety at Chernobyl, in his book Revenge of the Peaceful Atom, is quick enough to throw the designers and the scientists under the bus. He seems to have not realised that the bus could come back for him too. According to himself, the Chernobyl Nuclear Safety Department, which naturally he was a member of, measured and obtained the values we see in the table underneath. The disastrous values correspond to the 24th of April 1986, 2 days before the disaster. Maybe they hadn't been calculated yet or something. Look at the date column. Roughly every 6 months there is a set of measurements, except for a 10.5-month gap between June of 1985 and April of 1986. Enter Anatoly Dyatlov. In his book, How It Was, Dyatlov accuses Chernobyl's Nuclear Safety Department of a dirty trick. He states that the department was supposed to periodically conduct measurements of reactor characteristics, including the void and power coefficients of reactivity. However, the values available to workers on the 26th of April 1986 were false. The positive void coefficient was way lower, and the power coefficient was safely negative, whereas in reality the positive void coefficient was around 5 beta, and the power coefficient was positive. A fancier version of Dyatlov's book singles out this claim. Then, on the following page, the beginning of a document is provided. This document is dated at the beginning of 1986 and features a commission for the verification of nuclear safety at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, including Karpan's name. On the first page, we can see that on the 1st of January 1986, reactors 1 to 3 had no additional absorbers in them, while reactor 4 had a single additional absorber in it, same as when it exploded over 4 months later. Now, the bottom of this page also indicates that the figures to follow may not be from this date. Nonetheless, 3 of the reactors had no additional absorbers in them, for years in cases, and each reactor would have been monitored at the period of 2 to 2.5 years into its operation. Furthermore, for an extended period of time, Chernobyl Unit 4 was operating with a single additional absorber. The following page provides figures. As you can see, the power coefficient and the void coefficient match what Dyatlov wrote was known to workers. The power coefficients for all reactors were negative, and the void coefficients for all reactors barely exceeded 2 beta in one instance. After the Chernobyl disaster, alternative figures popped out and suddenly the magic number for the positive void coefficient of 5 beta was everywhere, including in Karpan's table and Annex 1 of INSAG 7, going back to the 1970s, and the first RBMK nuclear power plant. What the hell was going on with nuclear safety departments at RBMK power plants? Of course, what the hell was going on with big-shot Soviet nuclear power experts higher up in the chain is a question that needn't even be asked. According to page 37 of INSAG 7, the geniuses at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy and Nikiet had determined that during coolant vaporization in the core, the positive reactivity effect would increase to plus 2 beta F, and then fall off. Indeed, Soviet experts apparently believed that the RBMK design was consequently so inherently safe that an emergency protection system isn't even needed to shut it down. As early as 1980, however, different calculations indicated reactivity would increase to plus 5 beta F, and rather than shut itself down, a reactor would run away. What happened with this discordant feedback? Anatoly Dyatlov, in his article, Why INSAC Has Still Got It Wrong, answers us. Curve 2 of Figure 3 is shown in INSAC 7 as the actual dependence at the same time of the accident on the 26th of April. This is a Jesuitical approach, neither a lie nor the truth. A similar void effect existed at all RBMK reactors, and not only on the 26th of April. The curve was obtained several years prior to the accident by an employee of the Kurchatov Institute, V. Ivanov, and was subsequently confirmed by measurements. The administration did not believe Ivanov. They understood that an explosion threatened, but they did not check this out, either by calculation or by experiment. So there you have it. One might ask why Ivanov did not squeal. Only one person squealed, and that was V.I. Volkov, who was quickly disposed of with an invalidity pension. People often mistakenly think that the Soviet government or the KGB was dictating nuclear policy to Soviet nuclear experts. This was not so. Sonia D. Schmid's book, Producing Power, The Pre-Chernobyl History of the Soviet Nuclear Industry, often portrays experts as pushing for the adoption of nuclear power. In Politburo session notes after the disaster, senior government leadership rued the independence given to Soviet experts. However, things were not quite so simple. Remember that there was a U-turn in the 1960s when it suddenly turned out that nuclear power was a necessity for the Soviet Union. The Soviet planners embraced it and supported a rapid adoption of it. According to Sonia D. Schmid, between 1975 and 1986, 33 nuclear reactors started up in the USSR, including 14 RBMKs and 16 VVERs, compared to 13 reactors started up between 1954 to 1974, with only 1/7 of the production capacity. Nuclear power plants had become serious business. In 1985, RBMK reactors produced 60% of the Soviet Union's nuclear electricity. According to Nikolai Karpan, it was not lost on experts at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy in Nikyot that there were serious problems, along with serious consequences. The design of the power unit with the RBMK reactor, carried out by Nikyot and the Institute of Atomic Energy, had, at the time of the start of the operation of the first unit of the Leningrad Nuclear Power Plant, 1974, a huge number of deviations from the regulatory documents that existed since 1973 to 74, the requirements of which are mandatory for execution. The main ones of these documents were general provisions for ensuring the safety of nuclear power plants during design, construction and operation, OPB 73, and rules for nuclear safety of nuclear power plants, PBYA 0474. For none of the subsequent units built for the USSR Ministry of Energy, the RBMK technical design was not redeveloped, reviewed or approved, even after new safety regulations were put into effect. And in 1982, after the adoption of the General Safety Provisions, OPB 82, the RBMK project was not brought into compliance with the new safety requirements. A scandal was brewing among reactor developers, where there were representatives of different design directions. It was impossible to operate the RBMK with such deviations from safety standards. They urgently needed to be stopped and work carried out to eliminate design flaws. But in this case, the plan to generate electricity in the USSR would have been thwarted, and someone would have to answer for this with their career, a warm home, or even freedom. Therefore, the organizations responsible for this situation, IAE and Nikyot, began to look for an acceptable solution for themselves and found it. In 1984, they initiated a discussion of this problem at the Interdepartmental Scientific and Technical Council on Nuclear Energy, which made the decision they needed to postpone the elimination of design errors for several years, until the period of planned reconstruction of the units. In this simple bureaucratic way, the developers of the RBMK project managed to shift their responsibility to the Interdepartmental Council, which allowed the continued operation of almost 1.5 dozen of the most powerful nuclear power units that fatally did not meet nuclear safety requirements. This practice of avoiding responsibility and shifting the blame onto others continued after the Chernobyl accident. The Government Commission and the investigative team of the Prosecutor's Office, during the investigation into the causes of the explosion of Unit 4, received a large number of certificates, reports, and investigation reports, noting serious deviations from nuclear safety rules and design flaws in the RBMK project, but all of them were secret, and the public was not informed about them. It was not only the Soviet people who were deceived. The documents on the accident, presented by the USSR government to the world community and international IAEA experts, contained an overly detailed description of the RBMK reactor in general, but they completely lacked information about violations in the design of the reactor plant and its systems. In June, you will see 2 videos on this channel examining the efforts and no small successes of the masters of weaponized narration to deflect responsibility after the Chernobyl disaster. But we have one final stop at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy among some of our favourite characters to make. In 1981, Alexander N. Rumyantsev returned from the International Atomic Energy Agency to the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, where he was tasked in part by Valery Legasov to contribute to the development of the computing base at the institute, being an expert in the area. Rumyantsev notes that director Anatoly Alexandrov became president of the USSR Academy of Sciences, and his protege Valery Legasov received the actual management of the reactor areas, which contrasts to some degree with the cluelessness Valery Legasov professes on his tapes. But here comes the real fun. Let us read. At an expanded meeting of the party and economic activists of the IV Kurchatov IAE on November 13, 1984, which was chaired by A.Y. Gagarinsky, who had just been elected secretary of the party committee of the institute, I, on behalf of the OVTIR, director of the OVTIR II, Malashinin, as usual, urgently fell ill, laid to the bottom, outlined a program for the development of the institute's computing base for the future 10 to 15 years, as part of the implementation of the resolution of the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers. The program was developed together with I.N. Polyakov, then Deputy Director of the OVTIR, future Director of the Russian Research Center Kurchatov Institute, 2003 to 2006, with the active participation of the Chairman of the Council of Computer Users, L.V. Mayarov, and members of the Council. When presenting the program, it was emphasized that the lack of computing power does not allow the necessary analysis of the safety of the design decisions made for nuclear power plants, and that the most likely candidate for a severe accident are the newest RBMK units, with all the improvements introduced into them. L.V. Mayarov emphasized the acute shortage of computing power and the risk of unfinished reactor designs. In the first row of the conference hall, Building 158, sat A.P. Alexandrov and V.A. Legasov. V.A. Legasov reacted violently to what he heard, turning to personal insults against L.V. Mayarov. A.P. Alexandrov was mostly silent, but he took this information so close to his heart that 3 days later he raised the question of abolishing OVTIR, which was done. At the same meeting, Chief Engineer of the IAE, named after I.V. Kurchatov, E.O. Adamov, the future head of Minatom, made a proposal to build a garage and automated mechanical workshops instead of a computer center as part of the engineering reconstruction program he developed for the institute. As a result, E.O. Adamov's proposal was implemented. The resolution of the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers was ignored without consequences. The garage was built and stood empty for over 10 years until it was handed over to the automobile company Audi. Mechanical workshops declared all-union Komsomol shock construction remain unfinished to this day. The only person who unequivocally assessed what would happen at this party economic asset was N.N. Ponomarev-Stepnoy, who, after the end of the asset, told me the C&E Centre would be built. Despite all of the difficulties, the building for the Convention and Exhibition Centre was built 12 years later as part of the programme for creating space reactor installations, solely thanks to the initiative and support of N.N. Ponomarev-Stepnoy. The design assignment for this structure was written by I.N. Polyakov and I. This building, with all its facilities, turned out to be extremely suitable for the development of microelectronics work, and, then, for the deployment of multiprocessor computing systems in it. Tapes with recordings of speeches and discussions at this extended meeting of the party and economic activists disappeared from the archives of the party committee in May to June of 1986, after the accident at the fourth block of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. At a Kurchatov Institute meeting in November of 1984, it was brought to the attention of Kurchatov Institute director Anatoly Alexandrov and his first deputy director Valery Legasov that there was insufficient computing power for the necessary analysis of the safety of design decisions made for nuclear power plants. The newest RBMK reactors were identified as most susceptible to a severe incident due to all the improvements introduced into them, among which appears to have been a modified design of the reactor control and protection system rods. Apparently, it was intimated that the reactor designs were unfinished. Valery Legasov is supposed to have shouted down the warnings, personally insulting a speaker. Anatoly Alexandrov sat down quietly, but epically reacted by abolishing a computing department at the Kurchatov Institute a few days later. Furthermore, an unused garage was subsequently built instead of a computer centre. Soon after the Chernobyl disaster, tapes with recordings of this meeting disappeared from the archives. Somehow, it gets slightly better. In May 1986, during a personal meeting with V.A. Legasov, who had returned from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, I asked to be included in the Institute's team, which was engaged in analysing the causes of the accident. He promised to do so. 2 years later, after the death of V.A. Legasov, it was possible to find out that he had given the order not to let me analyse this accident for a cannon shot. I do not know the reasons for this decision. Clearly in Rumyantsev's recollections, Valery Legasov is hardly a hero. Rumyantsev likes to conclude his articles with a variation of the following. I do not rule out that S.M. Feinberg was right when he once told me at home, "Nuclear energy is not for these generations of people." I have nothing to add to this assessment. We would like to point out one more thing. The role the Chernobyl disaster played in the collapse of the Soviet Union is an interesting topic to consider, which we have not looked deeply into. Soviet leader Gorbachev was inclined to believe it was large, whereas many others minimize it. Certainly such a consideration would involve the liquidation effort as well as the social impact of the disaster being in favour of dissolution forces. In our pre-Chernobyl history, we have been touching on another aspect, the role of nuclear energy in the Soviet Union. In particular, in the western part of the Soviet Union, where industry was concentrated. According to Rumyantsev, the direct and indirect damage from the Chernobyl accident many times exceeded all capital investments in the nuclear energy industry of the USSR, and, in fact, having initiated an economic catastrophe in conditions of low world oil prices, led to the disappearance of the USSR. What was the damage to the Soviet economy? Less than 2 months after the disaster, Gorbachev remarked inside the Politburo on quickly piling up costs. Already now you see the resonance and the kind of expense. The loss of production by now is already at 1,800,000,000 rubles, and the expenditures for the object itself are about 2 billion rubles. In a word, we are talking about very serious things. Listen to this clip from the American ABC Nightline program a few days after the disaster.
Now, tell me a little something about the Soviet dependence on nuclear energy. How dependent have they become over the years?
Well, it now constitutes about 8 to 9% of their total electric supply. Their goal is to make it much more because their energy supplies, coal, oil, have been depleted in the western part of the country, and so they've instituted a regulation, basically, which says that any new electric utility built in the western part of the Soviet Union will be nuclear energy. And they build them in large clusters. There are actually 4 reactors operating at this particular facility. The first one was built in 77, and the earlier ones did not have a containment vessel, as your reporter indicated earlier. So they count on this, and this is really going to put a crimp in their efforts to...
A second interviewee reiterates the point.
But as Marshall Goldman observed, they have very little choice but to move in the direction of nuclear energy. They have no other options, so the fundamental Soviet economic policy is not going to change.
Chernobyl halted nuclear power in its tracks. Not only could capacity not be expanded by much, as nuclear reactor projects were in limbo and stopped, but safety modifications needed to be undertaken, reducing the economies of RBMK nuclear power plants, as well as taking them offline temporarily. If nuclear power was really needed in the western part of the Soviet Union, there must have been a serious economic consequence to the disruption and stalling of the nuclear power industry for the rest of the Soviet industry dependent on it. There is another angle we hadn't mentioned. Nikolai Steinberg, the chairman of the commission that wrote Annex 1 of INSAC 7, claims that in the 1960s and the 1970s, enormous deposits of oil and gas were discovered in Siberia that nuclear power was supposed to free for export. The export of these hydrocarbon fuel resources constituted the main source of dollar revenue for the Soviet Union. In the Politburo notes available to us, there are brief mentions of probably having to redirect power resources after the Chernobyl disaster, and possibly develop them. This may have been part of the picture as well. Pre-Chernobyl history provides us with context for the steps and reasons on the course to disaster. From idealistic scientists to harsher economic realities, sudden exigencies and opportunities, limitations and pressures, emergent dilemmas and difficulties, and even personal and collective failures, we see a clearer picture of the Chernobyl disaster than we could if we left our sight trained on a couple fateful dates in late April of 1986.